Many people have been doing a lot of post-Endgame revisionism on MCU movies, saying they were never really all that good, and that is definitely the case I see with Spider-Man. That set of movies are the best representation of who Spider-Man is. Everyone has their own opinion and preferences of who is the best Spider-Man, and these differing views have split fans into subcategories upon subcategories, and just generally makes discussion of the character a toxic mess. There are a lot of underlying issues across all of the movies, but many fans have a particular sticking point with the MCU set, and I think that's for a good reason. I personally have never been that big of a fan of the MCU adaptation of movies, and that is for one essential reason. And it's something that I think not only gives a lot of other fans a little bit of the ick when it comes to those movies, but it's also something that can't really just be rectified in newer releases. So what is the essence of being Spider-Man? Especially the essence that the MCU is missing. It's not Tom Holland's portrayal of the character. I actually think he works as Spider-Man. When the Tobey Maguire movies came out, I absolutely loved them. It was a character that I felt extremely attached to, represented in a way that I felt like I could relate to as well. The first two movies in particular, I think are absolutely masterpieces, and I also really do enjoy the third movie, even though it is a little bit of a convoluted mess. So already I am a little bit biased when it comes to these movies, but that doesn't really compare to how I feel about the MCU movies, where they're not super outright bad, but they're not really that great either. I think the problem with the MCU line of movies is it lacks the sacrifice that makes Spider-Man the character that he is. Sacrifice for a character like Spider-Man is what connects us to him. He's a heroic figure, and it makes him more relatable to be dealing with a struggle or setback that any person in a similar position to him would experience. So the MCU decided not to do an origin story, which is fine, and has been done before, and it lets people fill in the blank about a pretty commonly known story arc. But the problem that you kind of face here is that without showing or referencing the loss that Peter experiences because of his direct actions, the audience does not understand the value of why Peter acts the way he does or his sense of responsibility. First three movies act more as an origin told over 3 parts than the first movie being an origin and then the following movies being expansions of the character. And Iron Man is used as a replacement, as a leading figure or role model, but it doesn't really all work the same because Iron Man is a hero and someone that is leagues above everybody else. Iron Man obviously dies at the end of Endgame, but Iron Man's death is so far removed from Spider-Man that it doesn't make any sense as a driving or motivating agent. For all intents and purposes, Iron Man was just a guy that Peter knew and that he respected because he was a hero. There's no real scenes of Tony training Peter or anything. For the most part, Tony just uses Peter the entire time, gives him shit, and then he dies. And if there was supposed to be this big emotional relationship between the two of them, they didn't really showcase that a lot across the Spider-Man movies when they had the opportunity to do so. Sure, they hugged in Endgame, but it didn't really feel deserved. There wasn't enough of a build-up to lead up to that moment. And also, Tony's death wasn't Peter's fault. It wasn't a direct decision that Peter made that caused Tony to die. You could make the argument that, oh, Tony decided to go through with this plan because he knew it would bring Peter back, but Peter, he didn't know that for sure at all. And sure, Happy mentions it in Far From Home, but I feel like that's so emotionally removed from that situation. It doesn't seem like there's actually an emotional relationship between Iron Man and Spider-Man. And I think my biggest problem is that it feels like a lot of the decisions that Peter makes in the MCU movies are just really inconsequential or just kind of ridiculous. I mean, in a Spider-Man comic, do you think that Spider-Man would just hand over a massive military weapon to just some random guy that he has known for a couple of weeks? I mean, I feel like that's a little bit of a cardinal sin. And when Mysterio does eventually turn on Peter, there wasn't really all that much of a repercussion or time for Peter to reflect on the situation. There's no real consequence. No one gets hurt, and it turns out fine for the most part. The only big consequence was that Peter had his identity revealed, which wasn't even that big of a deal. At the end of Far From Home, literally every single important character in those movies knows that Peter is Spider-Man. Ned knows, Aunt May knows, Zendaya knows, the Avengers all know. All the important characters in Peter's life that would actually be impacted by knowing his real identity already know about it. I often got the feel across the first 2 movies at least that Spider-Man was just Iron Man light. In the Iron Man movies, Tony kind of just makes decisions and it kind of all just ends up working out without any major consequence. And I think the directors kind of felt that and realized, hey, he hasn't really undergone anything super significant or have to face any repercussions for his actions. So you know what we're gonna do? We're just gonna kill Aunt May out of nowhere. And then she's gonna give him the great power comes great responsibility speech in the 3rd movie. I also never felt any sort of emotional weight behind Aunt May. The same way with how Tony Stark wasn't really like a father figure for Peter. I never thought Aunt May, especially in these movies, was all that great, or I never really felt all that emotionally invested in the relationship between Peter and Aunt May. She always just seems to be worried about him, and then he's like, I'm fine, May, it'll be fine, and then it's usually fine, except for in the 3rd movie where she just dies. Personally, I think somebody like Ned should have died. Someone that you see on screen a lot with Peter, who is helping him directly with being Spider-Man, and it should have ended up with him getting killed for trying to help him. And honestly, I think it would have been cool to see the MCU completely ignore ignore Peter Parker's iteration of Spider-Man and just start with Miles, having no Peter. They could have built a character completely from the ground up and told stories that they really wanted to tell in the MCU model to bring more exposure to a character that is still Spider-Man. In the Tobey Maguire movies, particular with Spider-Man 2, it's probably the most relatable and, in my opinion, the best Spider-Man movie ever created, which is kind of funny because he isn't really even Spider-Man for half the movie. It showcases the ongoing struggle that Peter has with being Spider-Man. He feels like he's constantly split between his persona as Peter Parker and his persona as Spider-Man, that he never really gets to be present for really important moments. He loses out on things. He is constantly feeling like his life is just passing him by. His grades slip. He has people talking down to him like he's never there for them or show up for things. And so he decides to just straight up quit, like any regular person would do if they're put under enormous stress about a situation or feeling like their time is being split between two things. It's really hard to manage what you ought to do and what you need to do. Even beyond Spider-Man 2, there's a lot of other reasons why this characterization is so beloved by fans. There's actual weight behind a lot of the decisions that Peter makes throughout the movies. I mean, Uncle Ben dies from one of Peter's decisions. Peter loses MJ about 17 times because he doesn't show up to her plays. Harry hates Peter because he decided to be Spider-Man and go up against his father. And Aunt May loses her house. All because Peter isn't really present within his own life, but has to grapple with being Spider-Man as well. Like, that feels like a struggle I could go through myself. MCU Peter's biggest loss was his billionaire mentor, who died from the use of cosmic gems, or his aunt who dies from interdimensional villain. And so without this sense of sacrifice or the emotional weight behind his decisions, there is no Spider-Man. The MCU has a pre-existing formula to the creation of their movies, and so they tried to fit the complexities of a character like Spider-Man into the pre-established system. But due to the previous popularity and knowledge of the character, it makes the MCU's shortcomings with the character a lot more noticeable. At the end of No Way Home, Peter feels more like Spider-Man, but it shouldn't have taken 3 movies to get there. It makes me nervous to see what sort of ideas they have for future iterations of the character if Tom Holland decides to continue in the universe. What do you think of the MCU version of Spider-Man? Does it do the character justice? Let me know in the comments below.